Here is the complete story in one unbroken flow. David Marshall Williams was born into a family that had more children than money could comfortably hold. 12 kids on a North Carolina farm, and Marsh, as everyone called him, was somewhere in the middle of that pile, not particularly distinguished, not particularly quiet, just a boy who could not stop taking things apart to see how they worked. Clocks. Wagons. Anything with moving parts became his obsession. He would pull it open, study the insides with the same intensity a preacher studies scripture, and then try to make it run better than it had before. School was not for him. He left in the 8th grade, not because he was unintelligent. He was, by most accounts, remarkably sharp, but because the kind of thinking that interested him did not happen in classrooms. It happened in workshops. It happened in the dark when his hands were covered in grease and the only sound was metal against metal. He apprenticed under a blacksmith for a time, and the older men recognized something in the boy that was difficult to name. Not talent exactly. Something more restless than talent. A hunger that needed feeding constantly, or it turned inward and became trouble. It became trouble anyway. At 15, Marsh lied about his age and joined the United States Navy, because a boy with his kind of energy needs somewhere large enough to contain it. The Navy figured out the lie quickly. They discharged him without ceremony. He then enrolled at Blackstone Military Academy in Virginia, which lasted until school officials discovered that a collection of rifles and more than 10,000 rounds of ammunition had gone missing, and that the items had been shipped to the Williams family home in North Carolina. Marsh was expelled without much argument. He did not seem to consider this a tragedy. He went home. He got married. He needed money. The moonshine business in North Carolina in the early 1920s was, for a young man willing to work hard and take risks, a reasonable proposition. The quality of a man's whiskey was a source of genuine local pride, and Marsh Williams, applying the same mechanical precision to his still that he applied to everything else, developed a reputation for producing something worth drinking. He was 19 years old and doing well at the one thing he had found that paid. Then the raid came. On a night in 1921, sheriff's deputies moved on his operation. What happened next was the kind of thing that gets recorded differently depending on who survives to tell it. Shots were fired. Deputy Sheriff Alfred Jackson Pate was struck twice and killed. Williams said afterward, and continued to say until the last day of his life, that he did not fire the shots that killed the deputy. He said one of his workers had the rifle. He said he was not the one. The jury was not persuaded. The judge sentenced him to 30 years. 30 years. He was 20 years old. The Caledonia State Prison farm in Halifax County was not a gentle place. It operated on the principle that hard labor under harsh conditions would correct a man's character, or at least exhaust him into compliance. Marsh Williams was neither corrected nor complied. He was put on chain gangs. He worked in fields under guards who were not especially interested in his comfort. He was placed in solitary confinement more than once, sometimes for extended periods that would have broken men with less internal life. But here is the thing about solitary confinement that the people who design it do not always account for: it is only empty if the mind inside it is empty. Marsh Williams had a mind that was never empty. He lay in that box in the dark and he thought. He thought about mechanical systems. He thought about the problem of gas pressure in a firearm, how an explosion inside a barrel creates forces that move in every direction, and how most weapons of that era wasted enormous amounts of that energy, or managed it so clumsily that the weapons became heavy and unreliable. He thought about a small chamber that could float independently inside the main mechanism, capturing a precise burst of pressure to cycle the action without needing a heavy, complex system to do it. He thought about this for thousands of hours. He could not write it down at first. He could not draw anything. He simply ran the mechanism through his mind the way a musician runs a melody, over and over, refining each pass, removing what was unnecessary, finding where the resistance lived and smoothing it away in the dark. Eventually, the prison superintendent, a man named H.T. Peoples, noticed something about the inmate Williams. There was the obvious anger. Marsh Williams wore his bitterness openly, like a coat he had no intention of removing. But underneath it, Peoples saw what the blacksmith back in Godwin had seen: a mechanical intelligence operating at a level that seemed unusual for a man who had barely completed 8th grade. Peoples began giving Williams more freedom within the prison's machine shop. At first, Williams repaired tools. Then he began servicing the firearms belonging to the prison guards. A convicted killer, handling the weapons of his captors, an arrangement that would be unimaginable today, but which peoples defended on the basis that Williams was trustworthy with machines even when he was not trustworthy with very much else. Williams's mother began sending him materials. A drafting set. Technical documents about firearm designs. She also sent the names of patent attorneys, because she understood that her son was creating something real and that real things needed protection. The attorneys wrote back and explained that they could not help him. A man serving a sentence for murder could not, under the law of that period, file a patent application. He could invent anything he wanted inside those walls. He simply could not own it yet. So he built. Using scrap iron from the prison shop, wooden fence posts, and whatever other materials he could accumulate without drawing too much attention, Williams constructed 4 semi-automatic rifles from scratch. Each one incorporated his key ideas: a floating chamber that captured expanding gas with extraordinary efficiency, and a short-stroke gas piston that captured energy to cycle the action smoothly and reliably without adding significant weight to the overall system. The rifles were rough. They were products of a prison workshop and a very limited supply of materials. But they worked. Word traveled, as word about unusual things tends to do. In April of 1928, a Charlotte newspaper published a story about the inmate inventor whose creations could, in the writer's assessment, revolutionize the firearms world. Representatives from Colt Firearms read the article and made the journey to Caledonia to see what the fuss was about. They came to him. To a prison. Which told you something about how serious they considered the possibility. By that time, an unusual campaign was forming on Williams's behalf. His family had been working toward a sentence commutation for years. What made the campaign unusual was who joined it: the sheriff who had arrested him, several community leaders, and, most remarkably, the widow of the deputy who had been killed. She, whose husband had been taken from her by the violence of that night in 1921, believed that this man had suffered enough and deserved a chance to do something useful with whatever years remained to him. In 1929, the governor of North Carolina reviewed the case and commuted the sentence. Marsh Williams walked out of Caledonia carrying nothing visible. But in his head, he carried everything. He went back to Godwin and built a workshop behind his house. It was one room. It had a dirt floor for a time. But he worked in it with the focus of a man who understands, at the cellular level, that time is not guaranteed, and that every hour he had now was borrowed against the 30 years he had been given and the 10 he had served before being set free. He filed his patents. He developed his designs into more refined prototypes. He continued refining the short-stroke piston concept, making it more precise, more reliable, more adaptable to different types of firearms. Winchester Repeating Arms Company hired him to work on their development team, which was its own kind of complicated arrangement because Williams did not work well with corporate structures, did not take direction gracefully, and had strong opinions about how things should be done that he expressed without diplomatic softening. He was difficult. He was also brilliant, and Winchester was practical enough to tolerate the first quality in order to keep access to the second. Meanwhile, in Europe, something terrible was happening at a pace that was beginning to feel unavoidable. Germany had, in its campaigns through Poland and then through France and the Low Countries, demonstrated a new kind of warfare. Part of what made it so disorienting to Allied military planners was the use of airborne troops, soldiers who dropped from aircraft behind enemy lines, appearing where they should not have been able to appear, cutting off communications and supply lines before defenders could respond. It was fast, disorienting, and deeply effective. American military planners looked at this and understood two things simultaneously. First, that the United States would need its own airborne capability. Second, that the weapons being issued to regular infantry were not well suited for men jumping out of airplanes. The problem was mechanical and deeply practical. The M1 Garand rifle was, by general consensus, one of the finest infantry weapons in the world. General George Patton would eventually call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was accurate. It was reliable. It fired 8 rounds before reloading. It gave American infantry a rate of fire that few other armies could match. It was also nearly 10 pounds and over 3.5 feet long. A paratrooper jumping into enemy territory at night was already carrying an extraordinary burden. The harnesses, the reserve parachute, the explosives, the communications equipment, the food and medical supplies, by the time a man was fully loaded for a combat jump, he was carrying over 100 pounds on his body. The standard solution for bringing an M1 Garand on such a jump was to disassemble the rifle, pack it into a heavily padded canvas bag, attach the bag to the harness, and hope that upon landing, in the dark, possibly under fire, possibly injured from the drop, the soldier could locate his bag, open it, find all three pieces of his disassembled weapon, put them together correctly, load the weapon, and be ready to fight. Men died in those seconds. The United States Ordnance Department understood this, and in 1940 they issued a request: design a weapon that weighed no more than 5 pounds, was significantly more compact than the Garand, offered greater accuracy and range than a pistol, and could be carried by paratroopers and support personnel as a primary defensive arm. 5 pounds. It seemed nearly impossible. Military firearms of real capability simply did not weigh 5 pounds. Williams's short-stroke piston made it possible. The M1 carbine that emerged from the competition, incorporating Williams's patented gas system as its operational heart, weighed 5 pounds and 7 ounces. It fired a .30 caliber cartridge that sat between a pistol round and a full rifle round in terms of power, which critics immediately identified as a weakness. It was not as powerful as the Garand. It could not match the Garand at long range. But it could be carried by a man who was already carrying 100 other things. It could be fired immediately upon drawing it from a holster. It could be handled in confined spaces, in vehicles, in the close darkness of night combat where a rifle's length became a problem rather than an advantage. And crucially, for the paratroopers who needed it most, a version of it could be designed to fold. That version was the M1A1. The Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors, a company that had previously spent its existence making steering wheels for automobiles, submitted designs for a carbine with a folding metal stock. When the stock was folded, the weapon was 25 inches long. When it was extended, a paratrooper could brace it against his cheek and fire with reasonable accuracy. The stock was held in place by a spring-loaded mechanism that critics pointed out was not especially robust. Vigorous movement could cause the stock to shift unexpectedly. This was a real flaw, documented honestly by soldiers who used the weapon. They used it anyway. Because the alternative, the assembly ritual with the Griswold bag in the dark while the enemy advanced, was not a flaw anyone could survive. The M1A1 came with a padded jump scabbard that attached to the paratrooper's equipment harness. Upon landing, the soldier could draw the carbine from the scabbard, snap the stock into the open position with one practiced motion, and be armed and functional in the same amount of time it would take another soldier to begin unzipping his bag. That difference, measured in seconds, was measured in lives. June 6, 1944. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions descended into the darkness of occupied Normandy in the early hours before dawn, jumping into fields they could not see, into hedgerows they had studied on maps but had never touched, into a countryside where every shadow might contain an enemy soldier. They were scattered by wind and poor navigation and the chaos that combat creates before it even begins. Many landed alone or in small groups, far from their objectives, with no immediate knowledge of where they were or where their comrades had fallen. In those moments, in those first terrifying seconds after the parachute collapsed and the silence of the descent gave way to the sound of the actual world, the men who carried M1A1 carbines were already armed. They did not search for bags. They did not reassemble anything. They opened the stock, chambered a round, and moved. That readiness, the ability to be functional before fear had time to calcify into paralysis, was not a small thing. It was, for many men, the thing. The carbine was not perfect. The critics who said the cartridge was underpowered were not entirely wrong. At longer ranges, against enemies in heavy winter clothing, the .30 caliber carbine round performed less impressively than a full rifle round. But the battles of Normandy, of Sicily, of Market Garden, the airborne battles for which the weapon was specifically designed, were not primarily long-range engagements. They were fought in farmhouses and ditches and narrow streets, at ranges where the carbine's limitations became irrelevant and its advantages became decisive. Over 140,000 M1A1 paratrooper carbines were manufactured by Inland, all of them sole-sourced from that one facility, all of them carrying at their mechanical core the short-stroke piston that had been worked out by a man in solitary confinement. More than 8 million M1 carbines in total were carried by Allied soldiers across every theater of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, who was not a man given to understatement when the subject was himself but who was also not a man who flattered weapons needlessly, described the M1 carbine as one of the strongest contributing factors in the Allied victory in the Pacific. Not adequate. Not acceptable given the circumstances. Strongest contributing factors. Those words, from that man, about a weapon that the ordnance establishment had initially considered an impossible compromise, built around a piston invented in a prison by a murderer who had never finished school. Williams lived to see all of it. He lived to see James Stewart play him in a Hollywood picture in 1952, which he found enormously satisfying. He traveled to theaters across the country and signed his name for people who had come to watch an actor portray the unlikely arc of his life. He received 40 patents for various firearm innovations over his lifetime, each one in addition to the mechanical vocabulary that he had first begun developing in the dark of a solitary cell with nothing but time and a mind that refused to stay quiet. He donated his workshop to the North Carolina Museum of History in 1971, the whole of it, the tools worn smooth with use, the drawings made on whatever paper he could find, the prototypes built from scrap when no better materials were available. The workshop became a museum exhibit, one room extracted from a farm in Godwin and placed inside a public building so that people could stand in the space where the ideas had been refined and understand, at something closer to ground level, what it looks like when a person refuses to waste even the worst circumstances they are given. He died in 1975. The relatives of Deputy Alfred Jackson Pate, the men killed during the raid in 1921, objected publicly to some of the honors given to Williams even decades after his death. They were not wrong to remember their loss. Both things can be true at once, that a man caused irreparable harm, and that the same man made something the world used to defend itself when the world needed defending most. What the story of Marsh Williams and his short-stroke piston ultimately proves is something that military planners and weapons designers and critics of the underpowered carbine tended to miss. The question was never whether the M1A1 was the most powerful weapon available. The question was whether a paratrooper in free fall over enemy territory could pull it from a scabbard and be ready to fight before his boots had stopped sliding through the grass. Measured against that question, that specific, brutal, irreducible question, the weapon was not flawed at all. It was exactly what was needed. The flaw the critics catalogued. The stock that could shift unexpectedly. The cartridge that lacked the authority of a full rifle round. These were real. They were documented and acknowledged and discussed in military after-action reports. But the men who carried the M1A1 into the dark over Normandy, who snapped that folding stock open with one hand while the other searched for cover, those men were not thinking about the critics. They were thinking about the next 5 seconds. And for those 5 seconds, Marsh Williams had given them exactly what they needed. A convicted moonshiner, self-taught in a prison blacksmith shop, building mechanisms in his mind during thousands of hours of enforced solitude, had given the paratroopers of the United States Army the one advantage that no amount of additional firepower could have provided. The advantage of being ready.